Let's have a look at Newton's second law acceleration and how we can apply it to some sporting examples. So in the exam, we may well get asked to define Newton's second law of motion, and it's really important that we can do that. And then usually asked to apply that to a sporting example. So it could be explain why Newton's second law of motion applies to, and the exam gives you a specific example, or apply Newton's second law to a sporting example of your choice, or state which of Newton's laws is applicable here, and they might give you an example that's showing and describing and explaining acceleration, and you've got to identify it. So netball is an example. Netballer taking off from the floor in order to defend the shot. Again, I'm going to start a question that says explain why Newton's second law of motion applies to whatever with the definition. So N2, acceleration, a body's rate of change in momentum is proportional to the size of the force applied and acts in the same direction as the force applied. This rate in change of momentum essentially is acceleration. So a body's rate of acceleration, but we're going to say a body's rate of change in momentum is proportional to the size of the force applied and acts in the same direction as the force applied. The acceleration depends on how much force you apply, and you're going to accelerate in the direction that the force is applied. So again, we're going to substitute the words in our explanation for the words in the definition. So the rate of acceleration, the body's rate of change in momentum, of the netballer rather than the body is proportional to the size of, now what is the force? Here it's the reaction force that's generated from the floor. So remember, in order to jump up, we apply an action force into the ground, and that action force generates a reaction force bigger than weight. Remember, we achieve that greater reaction force through eccentric muscle contraction when we bend our knees, for example, in preparation for a jump, and through, for example, swinging our arms down to the floor. That creates a greater action force than weight, and therefore a greater reaction force than weight to allow us to jump up from the floor. The reaction force is applied upwards, so the netballer jumps upwards. That's the bit about direction that's really important. So we're talking about the size of the force and the direction of the force, okay? The greater the force, the greater the acceleration. The greater the acceleration, in this case, the higher the jump. And both of these parts are important to explain this. This second part is explaining how the size of the acceleration is proportional to the size of the force applied. So here, the greater the force applied gives us greater acceleration, and greater acceleration in a jump means that you jump higher, okay? So the rate of acceleration of the netballer is proportional to the size of the reaction force specifically that's generated back from the floor. The reaction force is applied upwards, so the netballer jumps upwards. The greater the force, the greater the acceleration, the higher the jump in this case. Let's have a look at the hockey ball. Again, we're going to start with the definition. N2, acceleration. A body's rate of change in momentum is proportional to the size of the force applied and acts in the same direction as the force applied. So the rate of the acceleration of the hockey ball is proportional to the size of the force applied by the stick. The stick applies the force forwards, so the ball accelerates forwards. The greater the force applied by the player through the stick, the greater the acceleration of the ball. Okay, the further that ball is going to travel. So see again how I've substituted hockey ball for body. I'm talking about acceleration specifically, proportional to the size of the force and the direction. I'm talking about the direction specifically. The force is applied forwards, so the ball goes forwards. I choose a direction, make it specific, and then go on to talk about how the size of that force is going to affect the acceleration of the ball. Back to our sprinter. Again, start with the definition. N2, acceleration. A body's rate of change in momentum is proportional to the size of the force applied and acts in the same direction as the force applied. We're going to substitute the words again. So the rate of acceleration of the sprinter out of the blocks is proportional to the size of the reaction force generated back from the blocks. The reaction force is applied forwards, so the sprinter accelerates forwards. So here, rather than our action force greater than weight and then reaction force greater than weight in a vertical direction, with a sprinter, they are they are pressing backwards into the blocks, okay? And so their action force is this way, and they're pressing to those blocks with an action force that's greater than their inertia, greater than their weight, so they're able to move, and it creates a reaction force forwards, allowing them to accelerate forwards. The sprinter who produces the greatest muscular force will have the greatest change in momentum, the greatest acceleration, and will start the race the best. So two sprinters with exactly the same inertia, with the same mass, same weight, if one produces a bigger force than the other, then that person producing the biggest force will accelerate at the greatest rate. The impact on their races, they get a really good start. Okay, they start quickly, they accelerate from the blocks the fastest. The footballer, N2, acceleration, a body's rate of change in momentum is proportional to the size of the force applied and acts in the same direction as the force applied. So the rate of acceleration of the football away from the player's foot is proportional to the size of the force applied by the footballer as they kick it. The force is applied forwards, so the ball accelerates forwards. The footballer who produces the greatest muscular force will kick the ball the furthest. So the harder you kick the ball, the greater its rate of acceleration, the further it will travel. The harder you hit the hockey ball, the greater its rate of acceleration, the further it will travel. And finally here, our golf ball, N2, acceleration, a body's rate of change in momentum is proportional to the size of the force applied and acts in the same direction as the force applied. So the rate of acceleration of the ball away from the club is proportional to the size of the force applied by the golfer as they hit it. The force is applied forwards, so the ball accelerates forwards. The golfer who produces the greatest muscular force will hit the ball the furthest. So this bit, the force is applied forwards, so the ball accelerates forwards, is specifically describing or applied to this part of the definition. And then this bit, the golfer who produces the greatest force will hit the ball the furthest, specifically is really explaining all of that bit. Okay, so it's important that you get both bits in order to get the marks for these acceleration questions. So once we understand that, we can think about, okay, well, how do we achieve bigger acceleration? Because if we're really going to apply this theory to sport, usually in sporting contexts, the greater the acceleration, the better. So how does our knowledge now allow us to maybe give advice to a player, a sprinter who wants to accelerate with the greatest rate of acceleration, maybe a hockey player who wants to hit that ball as hard as they possibly can. So we know the larger the force, the larger the acceleration, and we know that because we know that a body's rate of change in momentum is proportional to the size of the force applied. The greater the force we apply, the greater the acceleration. So we can start to use our knowledge about force in order to improve our rate of acceleration. If acceleration is greater if we increase force, how do we increase force then? So we know that force is mass times acceleration. So the force that we apply is determined both by the mass of the object that's applying the force and the acceleration of the body that's applying the force. If acceleration increases, force will increase. If mass increases, force will increase. If force increases, acceleration increases. So if the club in golf, the foot in football, and the leg and body that it's attached to, the stick in hockey, the bat in cricket, the person in sprinting is heavier, they will be able to apply a greater force. So in theory, we could say, well, choose a really heavy golf club because you're going to increase mass and therefore increase force, because force is mass times acceleration. Or if you're a footballer, have a really large inertia, really large body mass, because that will increase force. Or a really heavy hockey stick, or a really heavy cricket bat, or a really heavy sprinter. That's going to apply more force. In theory, that's absolutely correct. Secondly, though, if the club or the foot or the stick or the bat or the person has a higher velocity, if it's moving at a higher velocity, it will apply a greater force. Because if we increase this part, then we increase this part. So if we can move this golf club through quicker, if we can move our foot through quicker as it hits the ball, if we can bring our stick down quicker, move the bat and cricket through quicker, if we can, as a sprinter, apply the force more quickly, then we're going to apply a bigger force. And there is obviously a payoff between these two things. Mass for velocity. The bigger the mass, the slower that thing's going to travel. If you have a very heavy cricket bat, you can't move it through as quickly. So actually, usually in sport, it's better to be able to achieve those high velocities for a payoff for the mass. So we get greater forces. We're going to work on moving this stick through, or our foot through, or a body part through, with a greater rate of acceleration at higher velocities in order to increase force. And by doing that, we increase our rate of acceleration of that object. The rules often stop us from using things that are too heavy. So there are rules in sports like cricket about how heavy your bat can be, and that's to reduce this sort of benefit that you would get just through sports equipment. If you want a benefit, if you want to produce a larger force in order to produce a larger acceleration of the ball, then you have to get better at moving the bat through at a higher velocity. What else could we do? So we could maximise friction in order to increase acceleration. That's what a sprinter does by wearing spikes. They're not wasting as much force on as they drive away from the blocks, so it results in a greater net force and therefore greater rate of acceleration. We know with this sprinter that as they this is hard to draw, I'm not sure how to draw it, as they drive away from the blocks, they need a positive net force, don't they? They need a net force in this direction. And the bigger that net force, the greater the rate of the acceleration. So the greater the difference between air resistance and friction, the greater they are going to accelerate, because it's a larger net force. A large net force is going to equal a large movement. So in this case, large acceleration forwards. If it was a person jumping, then obviously the larger the net force in this direction, the higher the jump, the greater the acceleration. So the bigger the net force, the greater the acceleration. So if we can increase friction, then we're going to have a larger net force, a bigger difference between the size of air resistance and friction. The greater the net force, the greater the acceleration. We could also minimise, in the same sense, minimise air resistance. So as a cyclist adopting an aerodynamic shape with a small frontal cross-sectional area, that results in a larger net force. If we minimise air resistance, make that exceptionally small, then we've got a larger net force. The difference between friction and air resistance is bigger, and that's going to result in a greater rate of acceleration. Of course, finally, a player could improve on their technique. So a sprinter can improve their technique to make sure that the force that they're applying is generated horizontally rather than out to the side. And often, at school we'll work on sprint technique, making sure the arms are going forwards and backwards rather than out elbows out to the side, so that all that force is being generated forwards rather than wasted sideways. Okay, so that's Newton's second law of acceleration. Lots of sporting examples there, and a bit more detail about achieving greater rates of acceleration in sport.